What was it like when you finally went back to school?
It felt like I was in a bird in a bird cage and the door just opened.
Oh,
Yeah.
well, this is Hourglass, the podcast for United Way of King County in Seattle. Coming up, we'll look back at how the COVID-19 pandemic impacted students in and out of the classroom, and how a United Way-funded coalition of nonprofits came to the aid of young people, families, and communities during the pandemic. We'll also spotlight the South King County Food Coalition and an upcoming United Way event on addressing housing insecurity. I'm your host, Joe Burris. Thanks for tuning in. Most of us have stopped wearing masks. We're no longer keeping distance between us and others while in lines. We're not reaching for hand sanitizer as often as we once did, and our living rooms no longer double as our kids' classrooms. During the COVID-19 pandemic, those practices were commonplace in our lives. Yet this month marks one full year since the 3-year COVID-19 public health emergency officially ended. And although most of us are no longer practicing COVID protocols, many of us are still grappling with the effects of the pandemic. That goes especially for our youth. When it comes to class time during COVID, our young people endured an ordeal that was totally oblivious to generations before them. School was in person, and then it wasn't. Then it was a combination of in-person and at home, and then back to in-person full-time. Once in person, students had to sit 6 feet apart, then it was 3 feet. Many school systems insisted they wear masks, but even we adults couldn't make up our minds as to whether we should. Also navigating uncharted territory were our teachers. It's challenging enough to keep students attentive and engaged in the classroom. Imagine trying to do so virtually, unable to control distractions the students might have at home, or to give one-on-one instruction students sometimes need, or to control the quality of their internet or their devices. As parents, we did our best to help our kids navigate that period, but we couldn't turn to past experiences as our guides, and many of us had our own challenges, from lost employment to our own bouts with COVID, to skyrocketing inflation that kept us struggling to keep food on the table or the rent paid. Scholars and researchers have already begun probing the outcomes of COVID on our youth, and often they reveal findings that should leave no one surprised. According to researchers at Harvard's Center for Education Policy Research and Stanford's Educational Opportunity Project, public school students in grades 3 through 8 in the U.S. lost the equivalent of a half year of learning in math and a quarter year in reading during the pandemic. Researchers said that last year, students in many states made historic gains in returning to pre-COVID reading and math levels. Still, researchers said students in 17 states, including Washington State, remain more than a third of a grade level behind in math. While the pandemic affected students of all backgrounds, severity often differed by demographic. According to research from doctors at Wayne State University, the impact of remote learning during COVID was greater among children of color, those who live in poverty, those requiring special education, and children who speak English as a second language. Wayne State doctors said that overall, social isolation, heightened concerns over health, and adjustments to the online schooling process were major contributors to children's anxiety and depression during COVID. Fortunately for many youths in this area, United Way of King County and local community-based organizations were there to help youth, families, educators, and communities get through the pandemic. It was a mere coincidence that 1 year prior to COVID, 14 organizations of color formed a new network to support communities in times of crisis and provide programming that help youth celebrate their cultural identities and stay engaged in school. The group called themselves the Racial Equity Coalition, or REC, and United Way of King County helped convene the coalition, advocated for its funding, and subsequently provided financial support. Once the pandemic hit, REC members were there to provide not only programs that complemented students' virtual learning, but resources that supported their families. For example, REC member Red Eagle Soaring of Seattle, an indigenous youth theater company, continued to provide aspiring artists with native cultural traditions that promoted creativity and social engagement. During the pandemic, Red Eagle Soaring conducted virtual acting workshops, including one that was led by Oscar-nominated Indigenous actress Lily Gladstone. REC member Para los Ninos of Burien provides Latino communities with holistic, family-based education programs. And during the pandemic, Para los Ninos operated a vaccination clinic that provided food and gift cards for families, all while continuing to run its education programs. Now that we are 1 year removed from the pandemic, students who are members of REC organizations are grateful that those groups were there for the community during COVID. United Way of King County recently sat down with young people from both Red Eagle Soaring and Para los Ninos to hear how COVID impacted their education, both in and out of the classroom. We'll hear from Red Eagle Soaring member Helena Johnny, who was in elementary school when COVID began, and Zeppelin Andrew, who was in middle school. We'll hear from Para los Ninos member Miguel Monterrozo, who began high school at the start of COVID, and Alondra Gonzalez, a Para los Ninos youth organizer who was a student at the University of Washington during the pandemic. We'll also chat with current and former organization leaders about how the pandemic impacted and continues to impact the communities they serve. But first, let's hear from the young people, who began by talking about the first time they heard about the virus.
My name is Zeppelin Andrew. I was going to middle school in 2020, 8th grade. And the first conversations we had of it was I started wearing a mask because my mom wanted me to. And everybody around me was saying, "Why are you wearing a mask? Do you have COVID?" And they were just like berating me about it. And that's the first time I heard of it. So I was a bit confused.
Helena Johnny. At the time in 2020 it was happening, I was going to elementary school in the 3rd grade. And the first I heard about it, I was confused. I didn't really fully understand what was happening at the time. My mom started getting worried, made me wear a mask, and people were like, "What's going on, Helena? Are you sick? Is something happening?" And then I was just confused. I thought they were making fun of me in some way.
Miguel Monterrozo. I kind of remember like when we were that exact day that they told us we were gonna have like days off, that we had to leave early. And like everybody was like happy about it. But I wasn't quite sure what was going on until I went to my house. My mom picked me up and we were just like seeing the news and talking more about it.
Alondra Gonzalez. I was going to UW Seattle at the time, and I remember seeing different posts on social media, but it didn't really hit me more until I was in my biology class when one of the professors in a different class actually got COVID.
Wow.
And so they had to cancel our biology class. And then moving on forward, after a couple weeks, UW just started doing online classes.
So for each of you, when did you start not going to class in person every day?
The last months of 8th grade. And so that's when I started taking online classes.
It was also the last few months of school, and we heard of more cases. So we finished out the year in online, and then the entire 4th grade year was online.
During that time, we were doing mostly online, and then like further on during the year going on, we did hybrid. Like one day we go in, then the other day we do online.
I believe it was my 3rd year in college during the spring quarter when it was all remote, and then my last year in college was completely remote.
Completely remote.
Yeah.
Okay. And I do a mentorship program of some young people, and they were telling me about what it was like to do classes online. And one of them told me that during the class session, you had to get permission to go to the bathroom while you were in your house, but you had to put it in the chat. And sometimes the teacher wouldn't read the chat. And so you had to stay there the entire time. What was that whole thing like for all of you? Just something you just say.
Well, because it was my own home and I didn't really care if I got permission from the teacher or not, because I don't know, I was in middle school and it was 8th grade and I thought it didn't really matter. I just go to the bathroom and do whatever.
Yeah, they would tell me I needed to do that, but I didn't. If it got to the point where I couldn't hold it, I would just leave and like kind of give up on trying to convince her to look in the chat. Like sometimes I would even spam her. I'd be like, hi, I need to use the bathroom, but she wouldn't look. So the same thing goes for eating. Like I wasn't allowed to eat at all, even though I was hungry. And I just kind of gave up after a week or two and decided to go to the bathroom whenever or eat whenever.
Were you penalized at all?
No, they never found out.
I never really realized because, yeah.
And for you?
I know they would want us to keep the camera on,
Right.
like the whole class. And so like that was pretty kind of annoying. And then I guess for the bathroom part, I would go even if I wouldn't even ask for permission because like I'm in my own house.
Which was the next thing. What was it like to be on camera? And how often were you on camera with your picture, with everybody seeing you? And how often were you just not? Do you not have a camera on?
So in some classes, I was required to have my camera on. Like my PE class, we were still doing just PE stuff like push-ups or whatever, and I had to have my camera on, and they had to watch me do it, and it was just really weird. First, I don't know why they had us do that, but after that, they would ask for people to turn their cameras on, and nobody would just turn their camera on. Yeah, nobody would. So they just gave up on that after a while.
They gave up on that. So you're doing push-ups. Are they watching every one of you do push-ups one at a time?
I think that everybody just was supposed to have their camera on and to do it right there. Yeah, like how it would be like normally in class, where everybody was just doing it and the teacher would just watch.
And what was grading like for you?
Grading.
I had an easy A with everything, or easy 4, because during like reading assessments, they would just like share their screen and you could see what was on the thing, and they would make you read it out to them, and I would be like, oh, microphone issues, guess I can't really read it, and then she would give me a good grade either way. I would do the same thing with my camera. If I didn't want to turn it on, I'd be like, oh, camera issues, Wi-Fi issues, I can't turn on my camera.
I mean, yeah, that works.
How about you?
Yeah, for me, it was definitely harder because there was less assignments, which meant that every assignment that I turned in had to be the best, and there was no option for me to make it up, or like even classwork or like things where there were easier points to get. We didn't have that, and participation was really hard as well.
Grading was pretty easy. I felt like you didn't really need to try. It was easy to get A's and B's during that time online. I don't know. It just felt like easier. Like there's even kids who probably had the guts to cheat and all that. Because I mean, they're not there, so
yeah. And when you look at the last year for COVID and the first year of it, do you think you've learned less, as much, not as much?
I definitely learned less. Like, thinking about it, the skills I was supposed to learn, like the basic ones, like certain stuff with fractions and stuff, I didn't learn those. They would do basic review over like things that I've learned in past years. and I just kind of skimmed over it and learned it in either 5th grade or 6th grade.
Oh, really?
I feel like I learned a lot less in the school aspect, but I learned a lot more personally about myself and about how I'm living in that moment.
Mm-hmm.
It was a big shift in like my perspective and how I should look at the world.
What did you learn about yourself?
I learned that I should live more frugally and how I should, like, every second of my life really matters, because a lot of these big disasters really hit sometimes, and they're hitting a lot more recently.
And so what was it like when you finally went back to school?
It felt like I was in a bird in a bird cage and the door just opened.
Oh,
Yeah.
uh-huh. What was it like to spend that much time with your family?
It was nice. I got closer to my older siblings, and it was nice to just have them around more often, because before that, they were going through their high school and going out with friends and stuff and off by themselves. But when they were home, I was actually able to see them and hang out with them more often.
Okay.
It was good. It's just me and my mom, so sometimes we would get in fights, but like overall it was good. We got some more time there.
Now, the interesting part for you, you're graduating this year. Yeah, and what does it look like for you for after high school?
I guess the only thing I have in mind is that I'm going to community college.
Okay.
Maybe get some ideas while I'm there too.
Mm-hmm.
Overall, I want to do like something in tech. I'm not quite sure, but around that area.
Would you take online courses in community college? I haven't done it in high school.
I would at least try one class and do the rest probably in person.
Each of the current students and the former student were grateful to be involved with rec organizations during COVID.
I'm a youth actor at Ready Go Soaring, and I really like Ready Go Soaring because it helps me improve my acting skills. It helps me stay connected to my community. It's just fun in general.
I work at Para los Ninos as a youth organizer, and one thing that I like about my organization is how we are able to connect with the whole family.
It was important for organizations to maintain those connections during the pandemic. Don and Hazel Cameron run mentoring programs for youth that also pivoted during the pandemic to meet the needs of communities. Don leads Seattle Cares mentoring movement, and Hazel leads rec member 4C Coalition. The two programs complement each other and work in school systems to meet youth where they are. But Don said during COVID, in-school mentoring was not possible.
We were in schools on Wednesdays and Thursdays, and the pandemic hit. We thought, I remember the superintendent of schools said, we're going to be closed for 2 weeks so we can clean the schools up, and we're going to be coming back. Well, we didn't get back until about 2.5 years later.
Right.
So it really kind of caught everybody off guard because we had never experienced anything like that. So we just felt like we couldn't just abandon the kids and their families, We couldn't let a pandemic just upend everything for us. We had built a lot over those years. We wanted to keep the momentum. So we found a local nonprofit that gave us about 40 computers, and we gave those computers out. We had Zoom apps loaded on those computers. We jumpstarted our program in about 3 weeks.
Other organizations pivoted just as quickly. Joy Sebe, United Way Associate Director for Education Strategies, was an assistant director at rec member Open Doors for Multicultural Families when the coalition was formed. She remembers how the groups had begun sharing best practices and planning how to implement after-school programs for youth that celebrated cultural heritage. Then COVID changed everything.
At the same time, we also knew that many members of the Racial Equity Coalition are operating in a holistic way where they're meeting basic needs, working with families, reducing barriers so that young people could participate in programming. And so it was a natural kind of step when COVID hit that many of us were already working very closely with families, have case managers, relationships with families and young people. And so we pivoted because we realized that education for many was not the top priority. It was meeting basic needs. It was getting food, staying housed. And so at that time, the members of the Racial Equity Coalition were forced to pivot, to focus on how are we going to get money to get people fed, to get food out to the community. And this was before the CARES Act, before there was any federal government infrastructure for this, right? And so then that's when it was really critical that we already had an existing partnership and relationship with United Way of King County, because United Way was already positioned to be able to support us in that way with flexible funding. And so then first we saw a wave of need for food, and then as rent became due, we saw a really crisis in terms of keeping families housed. And so throughout the pandemic, what United Way was able to do was to work with members of the Racial Equity Coalition and provide close to $1 million in rental assistance funds. And so the Racial Equity Coalition members then came together, we were in a lot of meetings, had a lot of conversations to figure out how many families need support in your community. And we kind of map that out based on need, right? An equity-driven need. Then we figured out how much money each organization received. And so in total, the coalition members supported more than 1,100 households during that time, and then more than 4,500 individuals. And because the coalition members are so close to the ground serving youth of color, families of color, naturally, they already had staff speaking the languages of the community, trusted relationships. And so when we took a look at the data, we found that and it made sense to us that 98% of heads of households identified as people of color. And that really kind of, is consistent with United Way's commitment to racial equity and advancing racial justice.
Based on where you were in 2019 and then 2020 when COVID really took its hold, now we're a year removed from the pandemic. Where would you say things are now?
I think that we often, many of us who have a significant amount of privilege and resources, have kind of forgotten the impact, the financial impact, right? A lot of the emotional impact of COVID. And so I would really want to stress that our communities still are struggling with basic needs, and will for a long time, right? And that's why United Way's support of those basic needs is so critical. They're still struggling. We're still struggling with a need to connect with one another, to convene, to support one another. Again, a strength of United Way. The other place that I keep hearing over and over again, and I think many of your listeners would resonate with this, is that there's a significant crisis and need to support mental health among young people. We were meeting basic needs during COVID in a time of crisis. Young people and people across our region experienced significant challenges that have long-term impacts on our mental health, and we really need to think through and be mindful about how we approach that as a region, and as people who are kind of healing and continuing to support ourselves, our families, our communities, over the years as the impacts of COVID continue.
And those who attended classes during COVID have a bit of advice for educators and administrators, just in case this ever happens again.
Teaching the subjects the same way they would teach it at school over online does not work. I'm not sure how or what would be the right way to teach a subject online, but the way you would teach it normally at school over online just doesn't stick for me.
To learn more about the Racial Equity Coalition and other United Way of King County partnerships, log on to uwkc.org. United Way of King County partners with local organizations to help combat food insecurity. Those organizations include South King County Food Coalition, a Des Moines-based group of food banks that ensure everyone in South King County has the access to nourishing and culturally specific foods they need to thrive. The coalition's programs include Elk Run Farm, which grows fruits and vegetables that are harvested by volunteers and delivered to the coalition's food banks. For more information, log on to skcfc.org. And be sure to join our virtual event, Conversations for Change, Housing Stability, on May 29th at 11:45 a.m. We will delve into King County's housing ecosystem and share more about how we're coming together to help people overcome barriers to access and retain housing. For more information, log on to uwkc.org/events. At United Way of King County, we are working side by side with communities to build an equitable future for everyone. Hourglass United Way is a podcast that highlights how we and our partners spend time making a difference in our communities. Our work is made possible by the generous donations from people like you. Please send comments and suggestions about our podcast to hourglassunitedway@gmail.com. To learn more about our work or to support United Way, log on to uwkc.org. I'm your host, Joe Burris. Thanks for listening. Until next time.